It's amazing to think that this is the final Sunday night in Ramadan. Of course, next Sunday, inshallah, will be the Eid. And so we are very, very happy that those of us this evening that have joined us and those that will soon. And so I welcome you. I want to remind you before we get started this evening that this week, please remember your zakat al-fitr. It'll be $12 per family member, and that can be dropped off at the masjid between 6:15 and 7 o'clock at night, or you can go right online, uislamicca.com to pay that. So please remember that, and please continue to donate generously during this blessed month of Ramadan. So this evening for tonight's Sunday night lecture, we're going to be discussing the human brain and its connection to Islamic teachings. And with that, we have a special guest, Dr. Ubadah. He is a physician in the field of neurology and neuro-ophthalmology. He is born in Chicago, and he's been in Arizona for 2 years. Him and his wife have been members with UICA for the last 6 months, and they're very active in the community. And so I want to welcome Dr. Ubadah.
Thank you very much, Brother Hamza. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I hope you've had a blessed Ramadan. And today I really want to take the opportunity to talk about how Ramadan changes our brain, literally and functionally. As Muslims, we understand the importance of the Quran as not only the book of God and the Word of God, but also we consider it to be the way in which the manual in which we utilize our bodies and our mind and our brain and how to maintain that. And I'm gonna go over a PowerPoint here with sharing some slides, and inshallah I'm going to demonstrate how the brain and the mind are connected to Islam and how the Quran explains to us how it works and how we should maintain it and what happens if we do not do so. So I have my my slides shared. Do you guys see it here?
Yes, we do.
You do? Okay. All right. So the first thing I want to talk about is what makes the human brain distinguished from brains of other animals, including other intelligent animals like dolphins and chimpanzees and such. And if you see my pointer here on the left side of the screen, this is the human brain. This is the front part. This is the back part. This is the bottom. This is the top. And this burgundy colored stuff here in the front, this is the frontal cortex or frontal lobes. And this is developed in human beings much more so than any other being or organism, and is a distinguishing feature that human beings only have. And other animals do have these frontal lobes, as we can see here on the right side, but they're much smaller and much less complex. These frontal lobes give us the capacity to perform complex executive decision-making and calculations, planning, judgment, problem-solving, but also they help us with impulse control and inhibiting our actions and thinking about things before we perform them. Specifically, it's very well connected and strongly connected with a lot of neurons to the desiring and emotional brain, and which is right here. You can see on the left side here, there's these colored parts of the brain. These are common these are common parts of the brain that we share with a lot of other animals. And these are the areas that initiate emotion and motivational instincts that are required for survival. So fear and aggression, for example, are really necessary for any organism to survive in a situation where their life might be threatened. If they don't feel fear, there's no instinct for them to avoid the danger, and therefore they can die. Same thing for aggression when it comes to hunting and self-defense. And in addition to that, it's also part of the initiation of the motivation instincts like libido and hunger. Without those, there's no possibility that any organism or species can survive. And so these are things that we have as human beings as part of our brain. It's very hardwired in there. You can see the frontal lobes are literally sticking to them. They're very closely connected. And this part here also on the right is, I've used the slide to show you the center of desire and satisfaction and reward-seeking center, which I'm going to talk about in a little more detail when we talk about addictions in a few slides here. So ever since humans have been on this earth, there's this struggle, tug of war kind of between this survival animalistic desiring brain that motivates us and keeps us going, and the frontal lobes, the humanistic brain that makes us human and distinguished as humans, which controls this animalistic brain through impulse control and regulating whether we should or should not make decisions and actions and behaviors based on our desires. For example, a little kid watching Superman who has a lot of motivation to fly just like Superman does because of how exciting TV makes it, may decide to jump off the balcony and die because they think that they can fly. Now, this is an imbalance between the frontal lobe capacity, because they're a kid and they're not fully developed brains, and their motivational and desiring brain. And so this is an example of how if there's an imbalance, things can go bad. In normal healthy adults, the frontal lobes should be in complete control and keep the animalistic desiring brain in check. Now, if that does not take place or there's an imbalance between that, you can have a lot of issues, especially in the mind, like psychological disease. And the most common is anxiety, as well as depression and issues that other psychological issues that can arise from this imbalance. So now we're in the month of Ramadan, and it's the month of worshiping, and it's the month of fasting. And there have been a lot of studies that have been fascinated by the effects of fasting on the body and specifically on the brain. Part of that is when we're fasting, we are literally starving our bodies. And so our bodies and our brain need to rely on an alternate source of energy and need to become more efficient overall in its functioning and utilization of energy. So all the cells and neurons that are not really being utilized are gotten rid of and allow for those that are going to be utilized to increase in capacity and function and size. And so this makes the brain more resilient to all kinds of diseases, really. It enhances cognition and memory, and so it decreases the rate and progression of dementia, such as Alzheimer's, decreases the rate of progression of Parkinson's disease, it decreases the risk of stroke. Fasting is actually used as a form for treating certain kinds of seizures also. And it's also used to treat psychological diseases like anxiety and depression. And what's very interesting is that during fasting specifically, the brain becomes very well adapted to literally changing its anatomy, just like you would when you, let's say, work your muscles out. So let's say there's somebody who's paraplegic, can't move their legs, and they're working up their biceps. So they do curls, and after a while, their bicep muscles get bigger because they're working them out, they're using them, and therefore the body realizes that they need more muscle fibers to perform more task, and you end with a higher function and higher volume of tissue in the muscle. What about the legs? You're not moving the legs in a paraplegic, and so what happens, they actually atrophy and the muscle fibers wither away. And if you ever looked at somebody who's paraplegic, they can't move their legs, their leg muscles are very thin and very weak. And that's because the body realized I don't need to spend all that energy on maintaining and building those fibers. The same thing happens with the brain. In the fasting state, the brain needs to become more efficient, and therefore whatever parts of the brain you stimulate become more active, more functional, and more number of neurons and a larger volume of the brain develops. Now, worshiping in all different forms, including meditation, has been shown in multiple studies done at prestigious institutions like Harvard, Columbia University, King's College in London, National Institute of Aging, just amongst a few to mention, have shown that worshiping actually increases the activity of the frontal lobes that make us more human, that give us better judgment and better impulse control, and literally increases the volume, while at the same time actually decreases the function of the desiring animalistic brain and literally decreases its volume also. And so you have this simultaneous effect where worship overall, and most specifically fasting, makes us more human, literally, because we have more of what makes us distinguished from other animals, more volume, more function. And therefore, a lot of studies have shown that it makes people better at impulse control. And this is based on functional MRI studies where they scan people's brains before and after fasting, and they look at brain activity. So it's very impressive findings. Now, what happens when the opposite of worship happens, where we live in this culture of complete desire satisfaction almost at all costs, in this culture of materialism and absolute atheism also? All these things are on the rise, and as these things rise, we have more problems in the world, more chaos. And one of the explanations of this is you are literally enhancing the animalistic limbic desiring brain, and you're suppressing the frontal humanistic judging brain. And so it's basically the reverse effect of worship and fasting. And so we end up closer to the spectrum of animals who are not able to control their impulse because they don't possess the complex frontal lobes that we do. But even though that we do, we're not really utilizing them in the right way, and therefore we end up living in chaotic situations, similar to how animals may live in the jungle. Now, in more detail, a little bit, how this occurs in something that's a very common pattern that I've seen. This occurs, it's a connection between brain disease and mind disease, and it's called behavioral addiction. Now, we've all heard of drug addiction. It's a health crisis, and we have a lot of it here in Arizona. And we think of it as somebody shooting up heroin or methamphetamines or some form of drug, and two things happen when this occurs. When somebody's utilizing or abusing drugs regularly, you have they become dependent on the drug at one point, where they keep taking the drug and their body gets used to it, and if they stop the drug, they withdraw. And they get physical symptoms, they get ill, and depending on the dose and the kind of drug, it may be lethal. At the same time, if they continue to take the drug, they will eventually develop tolerance, where a higher dosing of the drug is necessary to get the same amount of satisfaction. And after a while, they have to keep going up on the drug, higher, higher, and higher, and eventually it may reach a point where they overdose, and it may be lethal as well. Now, behavioral addiction has those two paths of tolerance and of withdrawal, but not as severe, and it takes place over a longer period of time. it doesn't rely on an external chemical, but it does rely on an internal chemical, some internal chemicals. And the most prominent and studied one is dopamine, amongst others. There's like serotonin and a few other chemicals that are released in the brain, and they bind to part of the animalistic brain that we talked about, the limbic desiring brain, and that's called the nucleus accumbens, and that's where the center of satisfaction is. And this is very closely connected, as this diagram demonstrates, if you can see my pointer here, with the frontal lobes. And it goes back and forth. So there's the center of satisfaction. Once it receives the dopamine, will send signals to the frontal lobe. Hey, I'm having a great time. I'm feeling euphoric. Keep doing what you're doing to make me euphoric and happy. And then there's a signal sent back from the frontal lobe to the limbic brain, whether we should continue this or not, and how this decision of behavior to continue. So this is called reward-seeking behavior and reinforcement learning. And this is very, very strongly hardwired into our brain. It's not something you can get rid of. It's physically present, and it has a strong effect on our behavior and our psychological well-being and our mindset. And one of the things that are most commonly found to be addictive, and since we're in Ramadan, it makes a lot of sense, is food, eating. I mean, eating is necessary to survive, but it can be, amongst anything else that provides satisfaction, can cause a internal dopamine addiction. Especially processed foods, they've been carefully studied and designed in such a way to maximize, the amount of dopamine and amongst other chemicals released in the brain to get you literally hooked on it. There's almost very little to none nutritional value in these foods, but that's a big part of the psychological behavioral addiction behind this epidemic of morbid obesity that we see, and eating all this unhealthy food. Now, food is not just the only thing. We have almost anything can turn into an addiction. Other common things are gambling, but what's really capturing our youth today is video games, online gaming, and unfortunately, pornography. It's a huge, huge problem. And the reason I say it's a huge problem is functional MRI studies, as these images here show that there's an enormous surge of dopamine beyond anything that has ever been seen when people gamble, watch pornography, or play video games. And the parts of the brain that are really active, this is a functional scan where it shows the activity of brain, is right here, the most in the middle, right where the desire and satisfaction centers are in the brain. And you can see they also light up the frontal lobes to a certain extent in that connection that we talked about in a slide earlier. Now on this side, the blue represents actually a negative stimulus. So this diagram is specifically showing somebody who's winning during gambling on the right here, somebody who's losing on the left. So they have a negative stimulus, and so they have negative feeling, and they have this euphoric high, and then they go down and feel depressed. This study that I got from a Chinese study showed very similar findings, and you can see that the middle parts of the brain in the center, where the satisfaction and desire centers are lighting up like crazy while they're playing video games. And so this is literally an addiction. It's not even, we are seeing it, and we have proven it, that there's a chemical and functional addiction to these activities, and it must be explained to people who are performing them. It's also very important for them to realize that it's not only the function of the brain that changes, just like worship will change the volume of different parts of the brain. The frontal lobe makes it bigger, and the limbic brain, animalistic desiring brain, becomes smaller. This does the reverse. So it literally changes our brain volume to increase our animalistic desiring brain and shrink our frontal humanistic brain. So it really literally has the anti-effect of worship, and it literally changes their brain. And so after a while, when people get into these addiction cycles, regardless of what they are, whether it's gaming or even shopping, I forgot to mention is also another big one. When people get into these habits and they keep going on and on and on with them, now their frontal lobes, their judgment starts to get skewed, and they start to justify their actions and try to make sense out of them, just similar to how like a criminal would try to make sense out of their crimes. Now, this might not be like anything that breaks the law, like eating a lot of food is not against any kind of law, but it certainly is harmful to oneself. And it gets to the point where distorted cognition gets so into part of the mind process and thinking of these people who have addictions that just the fear of not being able to get their dopamine fix can cause anxiety. As a matter of fact, many psychiatrists, including Dr. David Burns, who's well known in the field of cognitive behavioral therapy, have defined anxiety and depression as part of a distorted cognition, where people believe that they're incompetent or not good enough, or believe that they're not going to get their dopamine fix, whatever it is that's getting them that dopamine. And so they get anxious, and then even if they do get them, they get their desire satisfied. At one point, just like hard drugs would give you tolerance, they also build tolerance over time. And then it's just not enough. And then they need the next level, and then they keep going up. And then after experiencing all the possible desires that they can, then what? There's this sense of emptiness and sadness and depression. Now, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more than 12 times mentions as the manual of fixing these issues, these mind and brain issues. He mentions more than 12 times that those who follow the Islamic way and live the Islamic life have لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. They have no fear upon them, and therefore they won't be anxious. ولا هم يحزنون, and they will not have any sadness or sorrow, and therefore they won't be depressed. And so this is our Quran, our brain and mind manual, telling us how to fix this problem and how to prevent it in the first place. And what I found that was even more interesting is that the Quran specifically talks about this relationship between the frontal lobes and the animalistic brain by mentioning the frontal lobes of Abu Jahl. In Surah Al-Alaq, he says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, نَاصِيَةٍ كَاذِبَةٍ خَاطِئَةٍ. Nasiya, in the Arabic language, is the front part of the head. And he describes that of Abu Jahl, who is the representation of the CEO, top CEO of corporate Quraysh. You know, they were very wealthy merchants, and he was probably one of the wealthiest. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes his frontal lobe function as a lying and deceitful and distorted. So the Quran is bringing this connection between the frontal lobes, their capacity, their function, and how that can lead into somebody's wrongful thinking and distorted cognition. And one of the things that is really problematic and on the rise, just as quickly as atheism is rising and just as quickly as anxiety and depression are rising, is suicide. And so I have a map here in the background that is showing the countries colored in darker red have the higher suicide rate. Excuse me, the one in orange are intermediate, and then the one in bright yellow are the lower suicide rate. So you can tell the countries that are atheistic, like former Soviet Union countries, Eastern Europe, and even Western Europe, and you can see here France is one of the darker ones. As atheism is on the rise, also here in America, you see the rise of suicide rates. And alhamdulillah, in the Middle East, North Africa, it's the least. Matter of fact, I don't know if you see it here, but Indonesia actually has the lowest suicide rate in the world. And so Indonesia has the highest, the country that has the most number of Muslims in it. And so you can see this, it's actually a health crisis. And these are figures based on 2016, and they've probably risen. As you can see from the graph, it keeps going up in the US. Matter of fact, in the US, every day there is about 120 plus people that commit suicide. And the Quran describes this very beautifully in saying, in multiple locations, describing those who do not follow the Islamic way of life. إِنْهُمْ كَالْأَنْعَامِ بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلُّ سَبِيلًا. Indeed, they are like domesticated animals because of this relationship between the overpowering, desiring brain and the weakened frontal human brain. And so therefore, they're closer to animals, just like we talked about earlier. بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلُّ سَبِيلًا. But indeed, they are even more deluded and deceived. And it makes sense because animals don't commit suicide, but humans do. And so it's like this frontal lobes are like double-edged sword. You can use it to become more humanistic and reach a level of peace, or it could, if you allow it to be the servant of your desiring brain, it could lead you to destruction and, in the most gruesome form, suicide. And so I've found in the Quran 3 different states of mind that sort of describes this balance between our frontal lobe and our animalistic brain. And so the first stage is an-nafs al-ammara, the commanding mind. This is mentioned in Surah Yusuf in the context of a situation where libido is the driving part of the desiring brain. And it's commanding the frontal lobes to perform and act and behave in ways that satisfy it. And the unfortunate truth is, this is the reality, is most people on this planet have this mindset where they're completely driven by their own desiring brain. Another state of mind that the Quran describes in this aspect is an-nafs al-lawwama, the struggling mind. The mind where the frontal lobe is blaming, lawm is to blame, is blaming its desiring brain. Why did you make me behave in this particular way? I'm not going to do it next time. And then there's this struggle back and forth. And then the goal really of, in my opinion, the goal of Islam and the Islamic way of life is to reach an-nafs al-mutma'inna, the serene, peaceful, tranquil mindset. And that's where the frontal lobe is in total dominance and total control of the desiring brain. And this is what Ramadan helps us do. It helps us get to that point by resetting the balance between the frontal lobes and the desiring brain, and literally increases its volume, increases its plasticity and its ability to adapt and change. And the points that I would like you to take from this is this struggle between these 2 different functions and aspects of our human brain, the desiring and the more humanistic frontal lobes, and how worship supercharges our humanity and resets that balance, and we should take advantage of Ramadan. And not only Ramadan, try to fast outside of Ramadan, try to worship as much as we can. And next time you pray, next time you do any act of worship, think about it. Think about how now, right now, as I'm worshiping, my frontal lobes are literally getting bigger. And my desiring brain is literally getting smaller. If you think about it that, and you actively think about it, it actually accelerates the process. And you will, inshallah, enjoy your worship a lot more. One thing that's very important to take from this is explain how addiction works to the youth. I've tried it, I've seen it. When you tell them not to play video games or not to do this or not to do that for no reason, or for a reason that they can't understand, not only does it not work, they may create this negative feeling towards you and repel them from you. But if you have them explain what I explained in this talk to them, or maybe even have them watch it, it'll make sense. And once it makes sense to them, and you tell them, you know, the more you do this, the more your brain is going to look more like an animal's brain, and the less you're going to be human. That will leave a strong impact, inshallah. And the last point I want to make is people all over the world have uncontrolled anxiety, depression, and have some form of behavioral addiction. In addition to seeking a physician's help, seek your local imam so that they teach you how the Quran, which is the manual for how your brain and mind works, to teach you more about it and to teach you more about the Islamic way to help you fix these issues. I mean, most treatments for anxiety, the doctor is going to give you a medication that actually changes that amount of dopamine or dopamine receptor activity in your brain. So you go there, you get hooked on your own dopamine, and then the doctor gives you something another chemical that kind of reverses that effect. Wouldn't it just be better if you didn't have the whole addiction in the first place? And that's what the Islamic way of life helps you with, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope I didn't make it too long and too complex. And if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Ubadah. Amazing presentation. I greatly appreciate it personally. Very informative and very, very valuable. Let's see if we have any questions. Brother Muhammad?
Barakallahu fikum. Very valuable presentation. Thank you, doctor. And I don't have any question as of now on Zoom. So I pass it on to Brother Amadou if we have any questions on Facebook.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Jazakallah khair. MashaAllah, it was very beautiful.
Wa alaikum assalam.
We don't have any questions on Facebook, but I do have a question for myself.
Go ahead.
I know you kind of touched it a little bit on it as far as the suicide going.
Mm-hmm.
So you know how things going on right now with the people being in quarantine and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And recently, we've been hearing a lot of suicide. Just recently, we heard that somebody had shot his 10-year-old son, by just the kid playing video game all day. So the dad got tired of it and shot him in the head.
Oh, wow.
Right. So what's the advice you can give those parents that will sit at home all day dealing with those kids? Like, what kind of like medical advice you can give them? I know it's going to be really kind of tough to really get them something really logic, but can you just go back to that little bit, that point, please?
About what people can do currently under the situation?
Under the situation, exactly. Under the situation. Dealing with the kids at home all day.
So in Arizona, alhamdulillah, the situation is not as bad as it is in other places. And people are able to go outside, and they should. They should go outside, not necessarily in crowds, keep social distancing. But if you go out, hiking or any kind of outdoor activity where there's a lot of space and there's not that many people close to you, that actually is very helpful. I mean, I know they closed the playgrounds for the kids, but you can get their kids their own toys or their own bicycle or whatever it is that they like to use. Of course, in the meantime, things are not ideal. However, it's definitely a challenge. But getting out of the environment, regardless of whether it's video games or whatever it is they're hooked on, changing the environment is a very important thing. Definitely, Ramadan is a great opportunity. Alhamdulillah, we have the opportunity to get closer to Allah and worship Him and be motivated to do that in Ramadan. And how, like I explained earlier, fasting makes us more prone to the effects of worship, the positive effects of worship on our brains. And so, in a sense, it's a really good blessing that at least we have Ramadan to sort of help us reverse these effects. That any kind of anxiety and depression may arise, regardless of the reason, being at home, or being afraid of becoming sick, or actually dealing with the illness. And so, it's not a silver bullet. However, it does help a lot, and this is based on a lot of studies.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that answered what you were trying to get to.
MashaAllah, Jazakallah khair. Beautiful.
Yeah.
I actually have a question for your brother.
Go ahead, Brother Hamza.
So you've explained to us that worshiping increases the size of the frontal lobe. Does it increase dopamine? Does it have an effect on the dopamine itself?
That's a good question. I haven't looked into the particular effects of dopamine, but any feeling of satisfaction is usually associated with a higher level of dopamine release. And so if you're feeling satisfied during worship, then yes, there is. However, the point I was trying to make in the talk here is certain particular stimuli, like eating processed food, for example, or watching pornography or playing video games, have an exceedingly high stimulation. And so the amount of dopamine released, amongst other chemicals, dopamine is just the example, released, it floods the brain beyond what is normal. And that is what makes it very dangerously addictive.
Right. And so those that have one of those many addictions, or others that could possibly be, so that addiction, in a sense, you would say, becomes their God. They keep going back to that for self-satisfaction, like a superficial Band-Aid.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I'm glad you brought that up. There's a verse in the Quran that says, أَرَأَيْتَ مَنْ جَعَلَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ. Have you seen those who have made their own whims and desires their own lords? And so many scholars will agree that this is a form of polytheism, where you're not necessarily worshiping an idol or another person, but you're worshiping your own desire. And that's what makes the situation so difficult to untangle, is people don't realize that they're doing this, and they don't realize that they're enslaving their own selves. And at the end of the day, humanity really is not benefiting them. Maybe the top 1%, they're financially benefiting from this, but the majority of people are certainly paying the price for it.
Right. Well, thank you, Dr. Ubadah. Jazakallah khair for coming on tonight. Greatly appreciated. I speak on behalf of the community. Greatly appreciated. Inshallah, we will see you soon. Inshallah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity, and we'll see you soon, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Assalamu alaikum.